Poveglia, the cursed island of the Venetian lagoon. In the heart of the Venetian lagoon, barely 3 kilometers south of St. Mark's Square, lies a small 7-hectare island that local fishermen avoid with superstitious terror. Its name is Poveglia, and for over 1600 years it has been a silent witness to a history as fascinating as it is disturbing. Historical documents preserved in Italian state archives reveal that this island, now completely abandoned and forbidden to the public, was in ancient times a prosperous center of life and commerce, before becoming the scene of unimaginable tragedies that would forever mark its destiny. The first official records mentioning Poveglia date from the year 421 after Christ, during the barbarian invasions that devastated northern Italy. According to historical archives preserved in Venice, the island received its original name of Poveglia, probably derived from the Latin populus, meaning poplar, due to the numerous trees of this species that grew abundantly on its fertile lands. Another documented theory suggests that the name came from the nearby Via Papilia Aenea, an important Roman road built by order of Consul Publius Papilius Laenas, which connected the northern Italian cities with Rome. When the Lombards invaded the Italian peninsula in the 6th century, systematically destroying inland cities such as Padua and Este, hundreds of refugees fled desperately toward the islands of the Venetian lagoon seeking protection. Municipal documents of the era record that Poveglia quickly became one of the main resettlement centers for these displaced populations. The families who arrived on the island were not simple peasants, but merchants, artisans, and experienced fishermen who transformed that temporary refuge into a flourishing and prosperous community. For more than 800 years, as recorded in parish and administrative registers preserved in Venetian state archives, Poveglia was a vital economic center for the Republic of Venice. The local families, whose surnames were recorded for posterity in official documents, such as the Musso, the Boiso, and the Barbalangolo, dedicated themselves primarily to fishing and salt production, 2 fundamental economic activities of that era. These Povegliati, as they were known, also maintained important commercial interests in nearby Chioggia and Palestrina, extending their economic influence beyond the limits of their small island. The prosperity of Poveglia was officially documented when, during the dogeship of Bartolomeo Gradenigo, the Republic of Venice decided to establish on the island the figure of a podesta, a magistrate with broad administrative and judicial powers. Historical archives confirm that this podesta had jurisdiction not only over Poveglia, but also over the important neighboring communities of Malamocco and Palestrina. This administrative fact demonstrated the strategic and economic importance that the island had achieved in the context of the Venetian lagoon. The community had its own parish church, dedicated to San Vitale, whose 12th century bell tower would become centuries later a somber symbol of the horrors that awaited the island. The Povegliati developed a unique and strongly cohesive cultural identity. According to documents from Venetian guilds preserved in historical archives, these island inhabitants enjoyed special privileges granted by the most serene republic. One of the most significant was the exclusive right to work as compravendi pesci, that is, fish merchants, a profession reserved only for a few groups in all of Venice. This commercial privilege guaranteed the families of Poveglia a constant source of income and a respectable position in Venetian society. But the year 1379 would mark the beginning of the end for this prosperous island community. Historical archives document with chilling precision how the War of Chioggia, a devastating conflict between the Republic of Venice and the Republic of Genoa for control of Mediterranean trade routes, dramatically transformed the destiny of Poveglia. The Venetian authorities, aware of the strategic position of the island facing the port of Malamocco, which at that time was the only navigable access to the lagoon for large vessels, made a decision that would forever change the history of this place. Official documents preserved in Venetian state archives record that the Senate of the Republic ordered the complete evacuation of Poveglia's civilian population. The families who had lived on the island for generations, building their homes, cultivating their lands, and raising their children on that piece of land surrounded by lagoon waters, received the order to immediately abandon their homes. It was not a temporary measure, but a definitive and forced evacuation. The military authorities needed to convert the island into a strategic fortification to defend Venice from the advance of the Genoese fleet. Administrative records describe heartbreaking scenes, entire families loading their few belongings onto small boats, looking one last time at the houses where their grandparents had been born, abandoning the gardens they had cultivated with their own hands, leaving behind the graves of their ancestors in the small cemetery next to the church of San Vitale. Many Povegliati wept openly as they rode toward Venice, knowing in their hearts that they would never return to their native island. Parish archives record that most of these displaced families settled in the sestiere of Sant'Agnes in Venice, maintaining for centuries their identity as a distinctive community. Despite the evacuation, Poveglia could not be saved from destruction. Venetian military documents relate that, although the authorities had built a defensive fortification known as the Ottagono Poveglia, octagonal in shape, the island was finally occupied by Genoese Admiral Pietro Doria. From Poveglia, Genoese forces relentlessly bombarded Venetian targets, including the monastery of Santo Spirito. When the war finally ended with Venetian victory, Poveglia was completely devastated. The buildings were in ruins, the fields had been razed, and the population, which originally numbered several hundred inhabitants according to documented censuses, had been reduced to barely a few dozen people. Historical archives confirm that the Republic of Venice attempted on several occasions to repopulate the island during the following centuries. In 1527, as recorded in official documents, the Venetian government offered Poveglia to the Camaldolese monks to establish a monastery there, but the offer was rejected. More than a century later, in 1661, the authorities offered the island to the exiled Povegliati themselves, hoping they would return to rebuild their former community. Again, the response was a resounding rejection. The descendants of those refugees who had been forced to abandon their homes preferred to remain in Venice rather than return to an island they now considered cursed. This repeated refusal to repopulate Poveglia revealed something deeply disturbing in the collective psyche of those who knew its history. The exiled Povegliati, although proudly maintaining their cultural identity and traditions in Venice, where they continued to practice their privileged trade as fish merchants and where even their representative had the honor of sitting next to the Doge on the Bucentoro during the Festa della Senza, never wanted to physically return to their ancestral island. Something about Poveglia repelled them, an indefinable sensation that the place was no longer suitable for human life. Ecclesiastical documents preserved record that the Povegliati established their own confraternity in Venice, significantly dedicated to San Vitale, the same patron saint of their abandoned church on the island. This confraternity initially had its headquarters in the church of San Trovaso and later in Sant'Agnes. Parish archives show that the Povegliati community concentrated primarily in the parish of Sant'Agnes, where they kept alive for generations the memory of their lost island, transmitting from parents to children the stories of their prosperous past and their tragic evacuation. Poveglia remained abandoned, with its buildings slowly crumbling under sun and rain, its fields returning to wilderness, and its bell tower of San Vitale rising alone like an accusing finger toward the sky. Venetian authorities finally decided to take advantage of the strategic position of the island for logistical purposes. Naval records document that Poveglia was adapted as a station for storage and repair of merchant vessels arriving in Venice from the south, taking advantage of its proximity to the port of Malamocco. But this practical use would not erase the melancholy that seemed to permeate every stone of the abandoned island. Venetian fishermen began to avoid the waters near Poveglia. Although official documents do not record the exact reasons for this aversion, oral traditions transmitted for generations speak of disturbing sensations experienced by those who approached too close to the island. Archives of fishing guilds briefly mention that those who sailed near Poveglia at dusk reported feeling an inexplicable oppression, a deep sadness that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Some swore they had heard voices carried by the wind, though the island was completely uninhabited. The island waited in silence, with its 18 buildings slowly deteriorating, its 7 hectares of land becoming covered with wild vegetation, its octagonal fortifications stoically resisting the passage of time. But Poveglia would not remain empty forever. Historical archives reveal that at the end of the 18th century, when Europe was struck by devastating waves of bubonic plague, Venetian authorities would again turn their attention to that abandoned island. What would come next would make Poveglia synonymous with horror and death on a scale that no 14th century Povegliato could ever have imagined in their worst nightmares. The bell tower of San Vitale, silent witness to centuries of history, would soon observe scenes of human suffering so terrible that they would forever transform the island's reputation. Official documents jealously guarded in Venetian archives were about to record a new and horrifying phase in Poveglia's history, an era in which tens of thousands of desperate souls would arrive on its shores not seeking refuge like those first 5th century settlers, but to die in agony far from their loved ones, in what would become the largest cemetery in the Venetian lagoon. For almost 4 centuries, Poveglia remained practically uninhabited, used sporadically as a logistical support point for merchant vessels navigating toward Venice. Documents from the Magistrato alla Sanità, the public health office of the Republic of Venice preserved in state archives, reveal that in the year 1776 Venetian sanitary authorities made a decision that would drastically change the fate of the abandoned island. That year, as officially recorded, Poveglia came under the direct jurisdiction of the Magistrato alla Sanità and was designated as a sanitary control post for all goods and people arriving or departing from Venice by sea. The choice of Poveglia for this purpose was not accidental. Administrative records explain the strategic reasons behind this decision. The island was perfectly positioned facing the port of Malamocco, the main access channel to the Venetian lagoon for large merchant vessels. Its natural isolation made it the ideal place to establish sanitary controls without putting Venice's population at risk. The abandoned buildings that had belonged to the prosperous Povegliati community centuries earlier were quickly adapted to accommodate sanitary officials, guards, and medical personnel. The bell tower of San Vitale, silent witness to so many historical changes, was converted into a lighthouse to guide vessels toward the new control post. During the first years of its operation as a sanitary station, Poveglia operated relatively routinely. Official documents from the Magistrato alla Sanità record regular ship inspections, verification of health documents, and brief observation periods for crews suspected of carrying diseases. Captains of ships arriving in Venice from foreign ports had to stop obligatorily at Poveglia to undergo sanitary controls before receiving permission to continue to the city. Goods were also meticulously inspected, especially those coming from regions where disease outbreaks had been reported. But the year 1793 marked a devastating turning point in Poveglia's history. Archives from the Magistrato alla Sanità contain a document dated that year describing with chilling precision the moment when everything changed. Two merchant vessels that had arrived at Poveglia for routine sanitary inspection were detained when medical officers discovered several confirmed cases of bubonic plague aboard. Official medical records described the unmistakable symptoms: inflamed buboes in the groins and armpits of the sick, extremely high fevers, delirium, and the characteristic dark discoloration of the skin that gave the disease its terrible name of Black Death. Venetian sanitary authorities acted with desperate speed. Official documents reveal that an immediate order was issued. No person from those ships could disembark in Venice under any circumstances. The sick, the potentially infected, and the entire crew of both vessels were placed in strict quarantine at Poveglia. The other two traditional lazarettos of the Venetian lagoon, the Lazzaretto Vecchio, which functioned as a hospital for plague patients, and the Lazzaretto Nuovo, used for preventive quarantines, had been operating since the 15th century. However, according to preserved administrative records, after 3 centuries of continuous operation, both facilities were in deplorable conditions, barely fit to fulfill their purpose. Documents from the Venetian Senate confirmed that, given the critical situation of the existing lazarettos and the new plague threat looming over the city, the decision was made to officially transform Poveglia into the Lazzaretto Novissimo, the newest lazaretto, a third quarantine and isolation facility to complement the 2 existing ones. Unlike the Lazzaretto Vecchio, which was specifically intended to treat confirmed plague patients, and the Lazzaretto Nuovo, reserved for preventive quarantines of potentially exposed persons, Poveglia would initially serve as a preliminary detection and isolation station for suspicious ships. Medical records from that first documented outbreak in 1793 are heartbreaking. Doctors from the Magistrato alla Sanità, wearing their characteristic protective suits with bird-beak-shaped masks filled with aromatic herbs that supposedly would purify contaminated air, examined each crew member of the 2 quarantine vessels. Of a total of 37 people between both ships, according to official records, 18 already showed unmistakable plague symptoms. Documents describe how these sick people were immediately separated from the rest and confined in one of the island's deteriorated buildings, where they would receive the minimal care available at that time. 18th century medicine had very little to offer against bubonic plague. Preserved medical archives reveal the treatments that were applied: bloodletting to balance the humors, application of hot poultices on inflamed buboes, administration of herbal potions that had no real effect on the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the true causative agent of the disease, although doctors of that era were completely unaware of the existence of microorganisms. Official documents record with brutal honesty that of the 18 initial patients, 16 died within days. Only 2 survived, though they remained severely weakened. The bodies of the deceased presented an immediate and terrible problem. Sanitary records of the era document that there was absolute terror that the corpses of plague victims could continue spreading the disease even after death. They could not be transported to Venice for proper Christian burial in consecrated ground. Documents from the Magistrato alla Sanità reveal that the decision was made to bury the victims directly at Poveglia. The first mass graves were dug in the island's grounds, and the bodies were deposited there, wrapped in shrouds soaked in quicklime to accelerate their decomposition and, doctors of the era believed, to neutralize the supposed miasmas that caused the plague. But the tragedy of 1793 was only the beginning. Administrative documents confirmed that, with the turn of the century, bubonic plague had not disappeared from Europe. Sporadic outbreaks continued to emerge in various Mediterranean ports, and Venice, as one of the continent's most important commercial centers, remained constantly at risk. Archives from the Magistrato alla Sanità record that Poveglia's function as Lazzaretto Novissimo became permanent. It was no longer simply an occasional sanitary control post, but a continuously operating quarantine facility. Administrative records detail the expansion of facilities at Poveglia during the following years. New buildings specifically designed to house people in quarantine were constructed. Separate areas were established for different categories: confirmed patients, suspects, crews under observation, and goods in airing periods. Preserved construction documents describe the building of communal dormitories, kitchens, storage areas, and specific zones for medical personnel and guards who had to maintain quarantine under strict surveillance. All this transformed the island's landscape, covering the remains of the ancient Povegliati community with new structures dedicated to isolation and death. Archives contain testimonies from ship captains who were forced to stop at Poveglia during their voyages to Venice. These official documents, presented as part of formal protests before Venetian authorities, describe conditions on the island. A merchant captain, whose name is recorded in archives as Giovanni Battista Morosini, wrote in 1802 that during his 40-day detention at Poveglia, he witnessed the death of 3 crew members who developed plague symptoms during quarantine. His official testimony describes the terror felt by healthy men, knowing they shared space with dying companions, fearing each day that they themselves would begin showing the fatal symptoms. Medical records from the Lazzaretto Novissimo reveal a disturbing pattern. As more and more ships were detained at Poveglia, and more people were placed in quarantine, the island began to simultaneously house hundreds of individuals in various states of health. Official documents confirm that inevitably, people who arrived healthy at the island ended up contracting diseases from others who were in quarantine. Overcrowding, precarious sanitary conditions typical of the era, and lack of medical understanding about how contagious diseases really spread, turned Poveglia into a place where death constantly lurked. A particularly heartbreaking document preserved in archives dates from 1805, during the period of Napoleonic occupation of Venice. Napoleon Bonaparte, as historical records confirm, took control of the Republic of Venice in 1797, ending more than 1,000 years of independent republican government. However, Poveglia's Lazzaretto Novissimo continued operating under the new French regime. Napoleonic documents reveal that the emperor ordered the demolition of the ancient church of San Vitale, which had remained standing for centuries as a symbol of the island's original prosperous community. Only the bell tower was preserved, already converted into a permanent lighthouse. Administrative records from the Napoleonic period also reveal an additional and sinister use of Poveglia. The island was used as an armament depot for French forces. Military documents describe how part of the island's buildings, which were not being used for quarantine at that specific moment, were converted into weapons and ammunition warehouses. This dual function, as Lazzaretto and military arsenal, added an additional layer of danger to a place that was already synonymous with disease and death. During the entire period of operation of the Lazzaretto Novissimo, which official documents confirm extended from 1793 to 1814, Poveglia received a constant flow of vessels in quarantine. Records from the Magistrato alla Sanità contain detailed lists of detained ships, captain names, ports of origin, and medical reports on the health status of crews and passengers. These documents reveal that even after the direct threat of plague began to diminish in Europe, Poveglia continued functioning as a quarantine station for other contagious diseases considered dangerous: cholera, typhus, smallpox, and various unknown fevers that doctors of the era could not diagnose precisely. Mass graves at Poveglia continued growing. Funeral records, though incomplete, document hundreds of burials during this period of 21 years of continuous operation as a lazaretto. The bodies of those who died on the island, whether they were foreign sailors, Venetian merchants, or even medical personnel and guards who occasionally succumbed to the diseases they attempted to contain, were buried in increasingly large graves dug at various points on the island. Documents from the Magistrato alla Sanità indicate that when a grave was completely filled with corpses, it was covered with quicklime and earth, and they proceeded to dig a new one in another area of the island. In 1814, as administrative archives document, Poveglia's Lazzaretto Novissimo was officially closed. The threat of major plague epidemics had diminished considerably in Europe, and authorities considered that existing quarantine facilities in the lagoon were sufficient to handle the sporadic cases that still arose. Poveglia's buildings were abandoned again, this time indelibly marked by the decades of suffering and death they had witnessed. The mass graves remained, covered by earth and vegetation that quickly began to reconquer the abandoned island. But Poveglia's soil now guarded a terrible secret. Historical archives do not contain an exact count of the total number of people who died on the island during its operation as a lazaretto, but modern researchers who have studied the fragmentary records estimate that hundreds, possibly thousands of individuals, found their final grave on that cursed island. Their bodies, hastily buried in mass graves, without proper funeral rites, without tombstones marking their tombs, without their families even knowing where their remains rested, would remain there forever. Venetian fishermen who sailed near Poveglia began reporting disturbing experiences, though these testimonies belong more to the realm of oral tradition than official documents. They spoke of an oppressive sensation when approaching the island, of strange mist that seemed to emerge from the ground even on clear days, of inexplicable sounds carried by the wind. No sensible Venetian voluntarily approached Poveglia after nightfall. The island had acquired a sinister reputation that would persist for the next 2 centuries. What none of these superstitious fishermen could imagine was that the most terrible chapter in Poveglia's history had not yet begun. Archived documents would reveal that the island would not remain abandoned indefinitely. At the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, as official records confirm, new authorities would set their sights on Poveglia, and the island would again house living human beings. But this time they would not be victims of physical diseases, but people considered mentally ill, locked in what official documents would prudishly describe as a rest home, but which later testimonies would reveal as something much more sinister and disturbing. Although the Lazzaretto Novissimo had officially closed in 1814, historical documents preserved in Italian state archives reveal that Poveglia's sanitary function did not end completely on that date. Throughout the 19th century, as recorded in the Magistrato alla Sanità archives and later in the archives of the Unified Kingdom of Italy, the island continued to be used sporadically as a maritime quarantine station for vessels suspected of carrying contagious diseases. Every time an outbreak of cholera, typhus, or any other epidemic disease emerged in Mediterranean ports, Poveglia would again receive ships in quarantine and, inevitably, more corpses for its constantly expanding mass graves. Port records from Venice document with precision the waves of disease that struck Europe during the 19th century. In 1836, a devastating cholera epidemic spread from the Middle East toward Europe. Sanitary archives confirmed that Venice, as a vital commercial port, established strict controls to attempt to prevent the disease's entry into the city. Poveglia was immediately reactivated as the first line of defense. Medical documents from that year record the arrival of multiple vessels on which cholera cases had been detected. Sick crews and passengers were disembarked at Poveglia, where they died within hours or days, victims of the terrible dehydration that characterized the disease. A particularly detailed document preserved in archives dates from 1849. A Venetian physician named Dr. Alessandro Benedetti, officially designated to supervise quarantine operations at Poveglia during a cholera outbreak, wrote an official report describing conditions on the island. According to his archive testimony, during a period of only 3 months that year, 87 people died at Poveglia from cholera. Dr. Benedetti describes in his report the impossibility of providing effective treatment, the lack of clean drinking water that aggravated the dehydration of patients, and the horror of watching previously healthy people die within 12 to 24 hours after showing the first symptoms. Poveglia's mass graves grew exponentially during these years. Official documents reveal a disturbing pattern. When a sanitary emergency arose, the island's abandoned buildings were quickly reconditioned to receive patients. Medical personnel and guards were temporarily assigned to Poveglia. The sick arrived, most died, their bodies were hastily buried, and when the crisis passed, the island returned to abandonment until the next emergency. This cycle of death and abandonment repeated dozens of times throughout the 19th century, as preserved administrative records confirm. But nothing that had occurred previously at Poveglia could compare to what historical documents reveal about the deadliest period in the island's history. Archives contain references to the Great Plague pandemics that ravaged Venice during the 18th and 19th centuries, far more devastating than the sporadic outbreaks mentioned earlier. Modern researchers who have exhaustively studied the fragmentary funeral records, documents from the Magistrato alla Sanità, and cross-references in Venetian municipal archives, have arrived at chilling estimates about the total number of plague victims and other contagious diseases who were buried at Poveglia. The most conservative calculations, based on verifiable official documentation, suggest that between the 18th and 19th centuries, more than 100,000 people died at Poveglia or were transported to the island after dying in Venice during the most severe epidemic periods. Some researchers, citing fragments of historical documents and estimates based on the known capacity of excavated mass graves, have proposed even higher figures, reaching up to 160,000 victims. Although the exact number remains debated among historians due to the incomplete nature of mortality records from that era, what is undeniable is that tens of thousands of human beings found their final grave on that cursed island. Archived documents reveal disturbing details about how corpses were handled during the most intense crisis periods. When epidemics reached their peak in Venice, with hundreds of people dying daily, sanitary authorities found themselves completely overwhelmed. Official records confirmed that the bodies of plague victims were collected from Venetian homes and transported in special barges directly to Poveglia. These vessels, known as barche dei morti or boats of the dead, as they appear denominated in documents of the era, made constant trips between Venice and the island, transporting their macabre cargo. A particularly heartbreaking official testimony preserved in archives comes from a boatman named Marco Zanero, who in 1855 presented a formal petition before Venetian authorities requesting to be relieved of his duty to transport corpses to Poveglia. In his official writing, Zanero describes scenes that had deeply traumatized him. Bodies piled carelessly in barges, sometimes 50 or 60 at a time during the worst days of the epidemic, many barely wrapped in torn shrouds, some falling into the water during transport due to overcrowding. His petition was denied, as archives record, and Zanero was forced to continue his terrible work under threat of prison if he refused. Documents from the Magistrato alla Sanità describe the mass burial process carried out at Poveglia during epidemic crises. Enormous trenches were dug at various points on the island, some with dimensions officially recorded at over 50 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 5 meters deep. Corpses were deposited in these graves in layers as specifically described in records. A layer of bodies, then a layer of quicklime, then another layer of bodies, and so on until completely filling the trench. Finally, everything was covered with several meters of earth. Documents reveal that in some cases, due to urgency and the volume of dead, bodies were simply thrown into graves without any religious ceremony or consideration for their human dignity. But even the enormous mass graves proved insufficient during the most catastrophic periods of epidemics. Historical archives contain disturbing references to an even more terrible solution that was implemented when space to bury corpses was exhausted: mass cremation. Official documents confirm the construction of large funeral pyres at Poveglia, where the bodies of plague victims were burned in massive quantities. These cremations, as medical records of the era describe, were considered necessary not only for practical reasons of space, but also because doctors mistakenly believed that burning bodies would completely destroy the miasmas that caused plague. Testimonies from ship captains who sailed near Poveglia during these periods, documented in official reports preserved in naval archives, describe columns of dense black smoke constantly rising from the island, visible from kilometers away. Some of these testimonies mention the penetrating smell that wind carried from Poveglia toward Venice and surrounding islands, a stench they immediately identified as burning human flesh. Meteorological records of the era, maintained by the Venetian Observatory, occasionally include notes about the dark fog coming from Poveglia that covered parts of the lagoon during periods of intensive cremation. An official report dated 1864, presented by the director of Venice's Magistrato alla Sanità to the municipal government, explicitly confirms the use of cremation at Poveglia. The document, written with the cold administrative precision characteristic of official archives, specifies that during a particularly severe plague outbreak that year, more than 1,200 bodies were cremated at Poveglia in a period of 6 weeks. The report justifies this measure, citing the complete saturation of all areas available for mass graves, and the imperative need for rapid disposal of corpses to prevent additional spread of contagion. The combination of mass burials and systematic cremations led to a physical transformation of the island that historical documents record with disturbing precision. Geological and topographical reports conducted by Venetian engineers at different periods of the 19th century, preserved in state technical archives, reveal significant changes in Poveglia's soil composition. A particularly detailed study conducted in 1876, 100 years after the island began functioning as a sanitary station, documents that soil analyses showed abnormally high concentrations of calcium and phosphorus, chemical elements associated with human bone remains, in multiple areas of the island. This same technical report includes a chilling estimate based on volumetric calculations of known mass graves and documented quantities of cremations. The engineers who conducted the study concluded that approximately 30% of Poveglia surface soil contained human remains mixed with earth and ash. This figure, though less dramatic than popular legends that would later claim 50% of the island was human ash, proves sufficiently terrible when considering its basis in verifiable official documentation. Venetian fishermen developed during this period an extreme superstitious aversion toward Poveglia. Archives of fishing guilds contain references to unofficial but strictly respected prohibitions against fishing in waters near the island. Although these documents do not specify exact reasons, oral tradition transmitted for generations provides disturbing explanations. Fishermen reported that their nets occasionally collected fragments of human bones when fishing near Poveglia. Some unofficial testimonies even mention finding complete skulls. The common practice, as documented in guild traditions, was that any fisherman who accidentally captured human remains in his nets had to immediately throw his entire day's catch back into the water and return directly to port, considering all the fish contaminated and cursed. During the second half of the 19th century, with advances in medicine and better understanding of how infectious diseases spread, major plague pandemics finally began to diminish in frequency and intensity in Europe. Italian sanitary documents reveal a gradual transition in Poveglia's use. The island stopped receiving plague victims in the massive quantities of previous decades, but continued functioning as a quarantine station for other diseases considered dangerous. Administrative records from the Kingdom of Italy document that Poveglia was used to isolate cases of tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus, and various tropical diseases brought by sailors returning from colonies in Africa and Asia. Poveglia's buildings experienced multiple renovations during this period, as preserved public works documents confirm. Old communal dormitories were divided into individual isolation cells. New pavilions specifically designed for patients with different diseases were built. Rudimentary ventilation systems were installed based on medical theories of the era about fresh air circulation. The bell tower of San Vitale, which had been functioning as a lighthouse for decades, received improvements to its lighting system. Construction records document that in 1882 an octagonal fortified structure was added adjacent to the main island, connected by a bridge, designed to serve as a military barracks for guards supervising quarantine. But despite all these infrastructure improvements, Poveglia could not escape its terrible history. Medical documents from the late 19th century contain disturbing references to psychological problems experienced by personnel working on the island. An official report dated 1894, presented by Poveglia's medical director to the Italian Ministry of Health, describes cases of extreme nervousness and severe melancholy among nurses and guards stationed on the island. The report specifically mentions that several employees had requested urgent transfers, citing disturbing experiences on the island that affected their ability to sleep and their mental well-being. Although the report does not explicitly detail the nature of these disturbing experiences, cross-references in later official correspondence provide some clues. A letter from 1897, sent by a nurse named Giuseppe Delasso to the Ministry of Health, describes how Poveglia personnel frequently reported hearing moans and laments during the night that could not be attributed to any living patient on the island. Delasso, in his official letter, pragmatically suggests that these sounds were probably caused by wind passing through the island's numerous abandoned and partially ruined buildings, but admits that the atmosphere of this place made even rational explanations difficult to accept emotionally. Administrative records from the early 20th century document a gradual reduction in Poveglia's use as a quarantine station. Improvements in public hygiene, vaccinations, and medical treatments had drastically reduced the threat of massive epidemics. Official documents reveal that by 1910, Poveglia primarily housed sporadic cases of tuberculosis and patients with mental illnesses who also suffered contagious physical conditions. The island's function was changing, and Italian state archives contain evidence of governmental debates about what to do with Poveglia's underutilized facilities. A document dated 1915 from the Italian Ministero della Sanità officially proposes completely reconverting Poveglia, transforming it from a quarantine station into a permanent facility for care of elderly people and those with chronic mental illnesses. The document argues that the island's natural isolation made it ideal to house individuals requiring constant supervision but who did not represent a danger to society. The proposal was officially approved, and archives document that renovation work began to adapt existing buildings to their new purpose. But World War I, which erupted in 1914, interrupted these plans. Italian military documents reveal that Poveglia was temporarily requisitioned by armed forces and used as a military hospital for wounded soldiers and, significantly, for those suffering from what was then called trench shock, what today we would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Military records document that hundreds of psychologically traumatized soldiers passed time at Poveglia between 1915 and 1918. Many of these men, as archives confirm, died on the island from various causes and were buried there, adding more bodies to the already overloaded mass graves. After the war's end, administrative documents confirmed that in 1922 the plan to convert Poveglia into a permanent institution was officially resumed. Archives from the Italian Ministero dell'Interno contain the official establishment order for what documents denominate a ricovero per anziani e convalescenti, a rest home for elderly and convalescents. However, other documents reveal a more complex reality. Among Poveglia's renovated buildings was specifically included a reparto psichiatrico, a psychiatric department, whose existence would be confirmed decades later by photography of a plaque with that inscription still visible among the island's ruins. Historical archives from Venice contain documents confirming that between 1922 and 1946, Poveglia officially functioned as a rest home. But the confirmed presence of a psychiatric department, together with later testimonies from Venice residents who vaguely remembered rumors about Poveglia's asylum, suggests that the institution housed both elderly people with senile dementia and other geriatric conditions as well as patients with more severe mental illnesses. The exact nature of operations at Poveglia during this period remains partially obscured in archives, with fragmentary documentation that historians still debate. What is undeniable, based on verifiable official documentation, is that Poveglia arrived at the year 1922 carrying upon its scarce 7 hectares the terrible weight of more than a century of massive death. The foundations of the new psychiatric and geriatric pavilions were built literally upon the remains of tens of thousands of plague victims and other diseases. The soil that the island's new residents would daily walk upon contained, as official geological studies confirmed, a disturbing mixture of earth, human ash, and bone fragments. And the bell tower of San Vitale, the only vestige remaining from the original prosperous Povegliati community that had flourished almost 1500 years earlier, now rose as a silent witness over an island transformed into the densest cemetery in all the Venetian lagoon. The year 1922 marked the beginning of a new era in Poveglia's history, although official archives reveal that this transformation was wrapped from the start in ambiguity and documentary contradictions. Records from the Italian Ministero dell'Interno confirmed the official opening of an institution described in administrative documents as Casa di Riposo per Anziani, a rest home for the elderly. However, later photographic evidence and testimonies from Venetian residents of the era suggest a more complex and disturbing reality than the official version presented. The existence of a plaque clearly visible among Poveglia's current ruins, photographed by multiple researchers and urban explorers, which specifically reads Reparto Psichiatria, confirms that the institution included a functional psychiatric department. Historical archives from Venice contain documents revealing that between 1922 and 1946, the institution operated under the official denomination of rest home. Researchers who have studied these fragmentary archives have found references suggesting that the facility housed a mixed population: elderly people with senile dementia, geriatric patients with various chronic medical conditions, and people diagnosed with mental illnesses requiring prolonged internment. This mixture of populations in a single institution was not unusual for early 20th century medical care standards in Italy, where distinctions between different types of long-term care institutions often proved blurry. Construction records preserved in Venetian technical archives document renovations carried out at Poveglia during 1922 to adapt existing buildings to their new purpose. The old Lazzaretto pavilions were completely reformed. New heating systems were installed, though rudimentary by modern standards. Former quarantine isolation cells were reconverted into patient rooms. New common areas were built, kitchens expanded, and improved sanitary facilities. Technical documents specify renovation of the bridge connecting the main island with the adjacent octagonal fortification, allowing access to additional buildings that would serve as dormitories and administrative areas. However, despite all these renovations, Poveglia's institution operated under significant limitations inherent to its location. Administrative documents reveal constant problems with drinking water supply, which had to be regularly transported from Venice in barges. The lack of reliable electricity, confirmed in multiple official reports, meant that lighting depended primarily on oil lamps and candles. The island's isolation enormously complicated regular supervision by governmental sanitary inspectors, as can be deduced from the scarcity of inspection reports in archives compared to similar institutions on the mainland. Archives from the Venetian provincial government contain partial lists of personnel employed at Poveglia's institution during different periods. These documents reveal that the facility operated with medical and nursing staff consistently insufficient for the number of residents it housed. An administrative report dated 1932 specifically mentions that the institution housed approximately 120 patients but had only one director physician, 2 qualified nurses, and 6 unqualified assistants. This staff ratio, even by medical standards of that era, proved clearly inadequate to provide appropriate care. The institution's location on an island literally covered with mass graves containing tens of thousands of plague victim corpses presented unique and disturbing challenges. Technical documents reveal that during excavation work performed in 1925 to install new drainage systems, workers repeatedly discovered human bone remains. A report from the supervising engineer, preserved in Public Works archives, describes how the island's soil constantly reveals evidence of its macabre past, with bone fragments appearing even at shallow depths. This report recommends suspending any deep excavation not absolutely essential to avoid disturbing the massive mass graves lying beneath much of the island's surface. Medical archives of the era reveal that psychiatric treatments available in the early decades of the 20th century were primitive and often brutal by modern standards. Academic documents on Italian psychiatry history confirm that during the 20s and 30s, common treatments in psychiatric institutions included prolonged cold water baths, known as hydrotherapy, which were believed to have calming effects on agitated patients. Physical restraints using straitjackets and bed bindings were standard practices for patients considered violent or dangerous to themselves. Available sedatives were limited and often caused severe side effects. A particularly revealing document preserved in Venetian Sanitary Service archives dates from 1936. It is a letter sent by a family member of a patient interned at Poveglia to the provincial director of health, complaining about conditions at the institution. The family member, whose name is redacted in the archive document for privacy reasons, describes a visit to the island during which he witnessed elderly patients wandering without apparent supervision, sanitary facilities in deplorable conditions, and an atmosphere of profound sadness and abandonment that permeated the entire place. The letter requests the patient's transfer to another institution, but the archived official response indicates that the request was denied due to lack of available places and other appropriate facilities. During World War II, Italian military documents reveal that Poveglia again assumed additional functions related to the conflict. Between 1940 and 1945, parts of the island were used as a military hospital for wounded soldiers and, significantly, as a convalescence facility for soldiers suffering psychological trauma related to combat. Military archives document the simultaneous presence at Poveglia of the rest home civilian population and military personnel. This mixture of populations created administrative tensions evident in official correspondence of the era, with mutual complaints between civilian and military authorities about shared use of the island's limited facilities. After the war's end in 1945, administrative documents confirmed that Poveglia continued operating as a long-term care institution. Archives reveal that in 1948 an administrative reorganization was conducted, and the facility came to depend directly on Venice's provincial administration. Budgetary records from this period, preserved in provincial archives, show consistently low financial allocations for the institution's maintenance and operation, suggesting that Poveglia was not a priority for post-war sanitary authorities. The 50s and 60s brought significant changes in social attitudes toward mental health and geriatric care in Italy and Europe generally. Academic documents on Italian psychiatry history reveal a growing movement toward more humane treatments, deinstitutionalization of patients when possible, and higher standards for conditions in care institutions. However, archives suggest that these progressive changes arrived slowly at isolated institutions like Poveglia's. An inspection report conducted in 1962 by officials from the Ministero della Sanità, one of the few detailed inspection documents preserved, describes buildings in advanced deterioration, defective plumbing systems, and a general sensation of institutional neglect. Archives of provincial medical personnel contain references to chronic difficulty recruiting and retaining qualified staff willing to work at Poveglia. Multiple administrative documents from the 60s mention staff rotation problems, with nurses and assistants requesting transfers after brief periods of service on the island. Although these official documents do not explicitly specify reasons, indirect references in administrative correspondence suggest that the island's isolation, difficult working conditions, and what one document vaguely describes as the particularly oppressive atmosphere of the place contributed to the difficulty maintaining stable personnel. Oral testimonies collected by local historians from Venetian residents who lived during the 50s and 60s provide additional perspectives, though less formally documented, about Poveglia's reputation during this period. These testimonies, though they must be considered with appropriate caution due to their anecdotal nature, reveal that there existed in Venice a significant stigma associated with Poveglia. Families who had relatives interned on the island frequently avoided mentioning this fact in social conversations. Fishermen continued maintaining their centuries-old tradition of avoiding waters near Poveglia. Venetian children grew up hearing whispered stories about l'Isola dei Pazzi, or the Island of the Mad, as some informally called it, though this was not its official name. A particularly disturbing aspect revealed by archives is the lack of detailed documentation about the institution's individual residents during much of its operating period. Historians who have attempted to reconstruct Poveglia's history have found that admission records, patient medical histories, and death records are fragmentary and incomplete. This lack of systematic documentation, though unfortunately common in institutions of this type during that era, means that the individual experience of people who lived and died at Poveglia during these 46 years remains largely unknown and undocumented. Venetian funeral archives contain some records of people who died at Poveglia between 1922 and 1968 and were buried in public cemeteries in Venice or on other lagoon islands. However, these records are incomplete and probably represent only a fraction of deaths that occurred at the institution during these decades. The absence of complete documentation has led researchers to speculate about how many people died at Poveglia during the rest home period and where they were buried. Some historians suggest it is possible that many were buried on the island itself, adding more bodies to the already overloaded mass graves, though no official documentation exists to confirm or refute this possibility. Provincial administrative archives contain the document that officially closed this chapter in Poveglia's history. Dated 1968, the document from Venice Province's Public Works Department describes a critical problem with the island's water supply system. Technical details specify that the submarine aqueduct transporting drinking water from Venice to Poveglia had suffered severe damage and would require extensive and costly repairs. The document presents a cost-benefit analysis concluding that, given the institution's small population and the general state of facilities deterioration, it proved more economical to completely close the institution and transfer remaining residents to other facilities on the mainland than to invest in necessary repairs. Official records confirm that in summer 1968 the final evacuation of Poveglia was conducted. Patients and residents were transferred to various institutions in Venice and the Veneto mainland. Personnel was reassigned to other provincial sanitary facilities. Buildings were closed and sealed. Administrative documents specify that island ownership was transferred to the Demanio dello Stato, the Italian state agency responsible for public property, where it would remain for the following decades. With this evacuation, Poveglia became completely uninhabited for the first time since 1922. The 18 buildings comprising the former institution, as cadastral records document, were abandoned to the elements. Without regular maintenance, without electricity or running water, without permanent human presence, the island began an accelerated deterioration process. Photographic archives preserved in Italian state archives show the progress of this deterioration over the years. Broken windows, collapsed roofs, vegetation invading buildings, walls covered with moisture and mold. But though Poveglia was now officially abandoned and forbidden to the public, its history had not yet ended. Official documents would reveal in following decades multiple attempts to rehabilitate, sell, or find some new use for this problematic island that carried upon itself the weight of 1,600 years of human history, including more than a century as one of Europe's densest cemeteries. The bell tower of San Vitale continued rising above the ruins, silent witness to everything that had occurred on that cursed island, from the prosperous medieval Povegliati community to the last patients evacuated in the hot summer of 1968. Archives from the Demanio dello Stato would document the years of total abandonment that followed, during which the island would become an occasional destination for urban explorers, horror film shoots, and paranormal television programs that would sensationalistically exploit Poveglia's documented dark history. But all these illegal intrusions onto state property, documented in multiple police reports preserved in archives, would only add additional layers of legend and myth over verifiable historical facts. The true history of Poveglia, that documented in publicly accessible official archives, proved sufficiently terrible without need for supernatural embellishments. An island that had housed tens of thousands of plague dead, that had served as a massive crematorium, whose soil contained, according to official geological studies, significant concentrations of human remains, and that finally had housed for almost half a century elderly and mentally ill people in conditions that official documents themselves described as inadequate. The evacuation of 1968 marked the end of permanent human habitation at Poveglia, but as later archives would reveal, it did not mark the end of the island's history. During following decades, Italian authorities would repeatedly attempt to find some productive use for Poveglia, always facing the fundamental challenge that any future development would have to be built literally upon the remains of more than 100,000 dead. Documents would preserve the record of these failed attempts, of the controversies they would generate, and of how a small 7-hectare island in the Venetian lagoon would continue fascinating and disturbing those who knew its documented history for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. After the evacuation of 1968, Poveglia entered a period of total abandonment that would extend for decades. Documents from the Demanio dello Stato, the Italian state agency responsible for administering public properties, reveal that initially there was no specific plan for the island's future. Administrative archives show that Poveglia was simply catalogued as state property without assigned use, and remained under minimal supervision. Italian coast guards conducted occasional patrols around the island to prevent illegal intrusions, as Guardia di Finanza records document, but there was no permanent human presence at Poveglia for the first time in almost 2 centuries. Deterioration of abandoned buildings progressed rapidly during the 70s. Technical documents preserved in archives from the Ministero per I Beni e l'Attività Culturali contain inspection reports conducted in 1973 and 1978 describing the structure's condition. Roofs of multiple buildings had begun collapsing due to lack of maintenance. Broken windows allowed rainwater entry, accelerating interior deterioration. Vegetation grew uncontrolled, with trees and bushes invading abandoned buildings. External walls showed significant damage from humidity and salt from the marine environment. The bridge connecting the main island with the adjacent octagonal fortification had suffered structural damage, making it dangerous to cross. Venetian municipal archives reveal that during the 70s the topic of what to do with Poveglia occasionally arose in city council debates. A document dated 1975 contains a proposal presented by a Venetian councillor suggesting converting the island into a public park accessible by ferry from Venice. The proposal argued that, with appropriate renovations, Poveglia could serve as additional green space for a city like Venice that lacked ample parks. However, archives show this proposal was rejected after technical analyses revealed the prohibitive cost of necessary renovations and complex legal and ethical problems related to developing a public park over a site containing massive mass graves with tens of thousands of corpses. During the 80s, official documents revealed the first serious attempt to find a new use for Poveglia. In 1982, as recorded in archives from the Ministero del Turismo e dello Spettacolo, the Italian government considered a proposal to convert parts of the Venetian lagoon, potentially including Poveglia, into film shooting sites. Documents explain that the proposal sought to attract international film productions by offering unique locations and governmental logistical support. Poveglia, with its abandoned buildings and decadent atmosphere, was identified as potentially attractive for horror films or historical dramas. Archives reveal this proposal advanced sufficiently for detailed technical inspections of Poveglia structures to be conducted. An engineering report dated 1983, preserved in state archives, evaluated structural stability of the main buildings. The report concludes that several buildings presented significant collapse risks and would require extensive structural reinforcements before they could be safely used even for film shoots with limited human presence. Estimated costs for these safety improvements proved high enough that the proposal was finally abandoned, as ministerial minutes document. However, though official plans to use Poveglia for film purposes never materialized, the island began attracting different types of attention during this period. Guardia di Finanza archives contain multiple reports of illegal intrusions on the island during the 80s and 90s. Urban explorers, photographers, and ghost hunters began visiting Poveglia illegally, arriving in small private boats during nighttime to avoid detection. These police reports document occasional arrests of individuals found on the island without authorization, though archives suggest many more intrusions probably occurred without being detected. The 90s brought a new chapter in attempts to find a use for Poveglia. In 1997, as documented in Centro Turistico Studentesco e Giovanile Archives, this youth organization presented a detailed plan to convert Poveglia into a youth hostel. The proposal argued that the island could offer economical accommodation for students and young travelers visiting Venice, helping alleviate the chronic shortage of affordable lodging in the city. Documents reveal the proposal included architectural plans to renovate several existing buildings, installation of new water and electricity systems, and establishment of regular ferry service between Poveglia and Venice. Archives from the Italian Ministero del Tesoro contain the official response to this proposal. In 1999, the ministry announced it would exclude Poveglia from the list of state properties available for sale to private interests and instead transfer it to the Demanio to be granted to Centro Turistico Studentesco e Giovanile for the hostel project. This decision represented a compromise between governmental desire to find some productive use for the island and public resistance to the idea of selling Poveglia to private developers who might build commercial projects over a site of such historical importance and cultural sensitivity. However, documents reveal the youth hostel project never materialized. Archives contain correspondence between Centro Turistico Studentesco e Giovanile and various governmental agencies during following years, discussing financial, regulatory, and logistical obstacles preventing project progress. By the year 2003, as administrative documents confirm, the project had been completely abandoned. Poveglia was transferred to Arsenale di Venezia SpA, a company of shared ownership between the municipality of Venice and the Demanio dello Stato, established to administer various public properties in the Venetian lagoon. During the first decade of the 21st century, Poveglia began receiving a completely different type of attention that would transform its international reputation. Archives of special permits issued by the municipality of Venice reveal that in the 2000s, multiple television production teams requested and occasionally received permission to film at Poveglia. These teams, primarily from American and international television programs dedicated to paranormal topics, arrived on the island to create episodes about its supposedly haunted nature. The American television program Ghost Adventures filmed an episode at Poveglia that aired in 2009, as filming permit archives document. This episode, which reached significant international audiences, presented dramatizations of the island's history mixed with supposed paranormal investigations. Though basic historical facts about Poveglia as a plague quarantine site and later psychiatric institution were correct, the program considerably embellished these facts with sensationalist elements and unverifiable supernatural claims. Archives reveal multiple other similar programs filmed at Poveglia during this period, each contributing to the island's growing international reputation as one of the world's most haunted places. This international media attention had unforeseen consequences documented in archives. Guardia di Finanza reports show a dramatic increase in illegal intrusions at Poveglia during the 2010s, with amateur ghost hunters, YouTubers, and curious tourists attempting to visit the island to experience its supposedly paranormal nature for themselves. Police archives document that Venetian authorities were forced to increase patrols around the island and establish surveillance systems to detect intruders. Multiple people were arrested and fined for illegal entry onto state property, as judicial records confirm. But it was in the year 2014 when Poveglia captured national and international attention for completely different reasons. Documents from the Agenzia del Demanio reveal that on March 6, 2014, the agency officially included Poveglia in an invito pubblico ad offrire, a public invitation to present purchase or long-term lease offers. This decision was part of a broader governmental program to monetize underutilized state properties and generate revenue for public coffers. Official documents specified that Poveglia would be offered under a 99-year concession, maintaining state ownership but allowing the concessionaire to develop and use the island according to plans approved by authorities. Italian press archives contain extensive coverage of public reaction to this announcement. Many Venetians and Italian citizens expressed outrage at the idea that a site of such historical and cultural importance could be handed over to private interests potentially motivated only by commercial gain. Newspaper articles from the era, archived in public libraries, document passionate debates about the appropriate future for Poveglia. Some argued the island should be preserved as a historical monument and memorial site for the tens of thousands who died there. Others maintained that allowing private development was the only realistic way to prevent total deterioration of the island's historic structures. In response to the governmental proposal to concession Poveglia, official documents reveal the formation in April 2014 of a citizen association called Poveglia per tutti, Poveglia for everyone. Non-profit association Registry Archives confirmed the official creation of this organization, whose stated purpose was to raise funds to compete in the governmental bidding and ensure Poveglia remained as a public good accessible to all citizens rather than becoming de facto private property. Association documents reveal they established a contribution system where anyone could donate €99, €1 for each year of the proposed concession, to support the public bid. Bank archives from Poveglia Pertuti, which were subsequently made publicly available, document that the fundraising campaign achieved remarkable success. More than 4,500 people, as official records confirm, contributed to the campaign. The association managed to raise €460,000 in total. This level of citizen participation demonstrated strong public sentiment that Poveglia should remain as public heritage and not be handed to private commercial interests. However, Poveglia Pertuti was not the only party interested in the island's concession. Auction documents reveal that Luigi Brugnero, a Venetian businessman who would later become Venice's mayor, presented an offer through his company Umana. Official bidding archives document that on May 13, 2014, the day offers closed, Brugnero presented the highest bid, €513,000, significantly more than the €460,000 raised by Poveglia Pertuti. But official documents from the Agenzia del Demanio reveal an unexpected twist. After reviewing offers, the governmental commission charged with evaluating proposals determined that even the highest bid of €513,000 was incongrua, that is, insufficient considering the property's estimated value and necessary renovation costs. Official archives confirm that the commission rejected all presented offers, including both Brugnero's and Poveglia Pertuti's. The island would remain as state property without being concessioned. Preserved judicial documents reveal that Brugnero filed a formal appeal before the Tribunal Amministrativo Regionale, the regional administrative court, challenging the decision to reject his offer. Court archives document the legal proceedings that followed, with arguments presented both by Brugnero and governmental representatives defending the commission's decision. However, records show the appeal ultimately did not prosper, and the decision not to concession Poveglia was confirmed. The failed auction of 2014 left Poveglia in an administrative limbo documented in later governmental archives. The island remained as state property, still under administration of Arsenale di Venezia SPA according to some documents and directly under the Demanio dello Stato according to others, with this administrative ambiguity apparent in the documentation itself. There was no clear plan for its future. Structures continued deteriorating without any maintenance or conservation program. Access remained officially forbidden to the public, though illegal intrusions continued according to recent police reports. Agenzia del Demanio archives reveal that in 2022, the Italian government published a new notice seeking people interested in purchasing or taking the island in concession. This notice, as official archives document, specified that interested parties should present detailed proposals explaining how they plan to use and develop Poveglia in a manner compatible with its historical and cultural importance. Documents do not reveal how many proposals, if any, were presented in response to this notice, and available public archives contain no information about any decision taken as a result of this process. During all these decades of abandonment, failed development attempts, and debates about its future, Poveglia remained physically accessible only to those willing to violate the law by entering illegally. Photographic documents and reports from urban explorers who illegally visited the island during these years, later shared on the internet and occasionally confiscated by authorities, show the inexorable progress of deterioration. Completely collapsed roofs, rotted floors making walking in buildings dangerous, vegetation that had completely invaded some structures, walls covered with graffiti left by illegal visitors, and a general atmosphere of decay and abandonment. The bell tower of San Vitale, the island's most robust and symbolic structure, resisted the passage of time better than the more modern buildings constructed during the 19th and 20th centuries. Technical documents from structural inspections revealed that the bell tower, originally built in the 12th century with solid medieval construction techniques, maintained its fundamental structural integrity despite decades without maintenance. It remained as Poveglia's most visible symbol, visible from kilometers away across the lagoon, a silent reminder of the 1600 years of human history, both prosperous and tragic, that had occurred on that 7-hectare island. Archives documented that Poveglia had remained in this state of official abandonment for more than 46 years since its evacuation in 1968. None of the multiple attempts to find a new use for the island had succeeded. The fundamental question remained unresolved. What to do with a place that was simultaneously a site of significant historical importance, the unmarked cemetery of tens of thousands of people, and a symbol of dark chapters in Venice's and humanity's history in general? Official documents provided no clear answer to this question, and Poveglia entered the third decade of the 21st century still awaiting resolution to its uncertain future. After the failed auction of 2014, Poveglia remained in a state of continuous abandonment for more than an additional decade. Official documents from the Agenzia del Demanio reveal sporadic attempts during these years to generate interest in the island, but none resulted in concrete action. Venetian municipal archives contain council meeting minutes where the topic of Poveglia occasionally arose, with councillors asking about the property's status and expressing frustration at the apparent inability to find a solution to the problem represented by this historic but problematic abandoned island in the middle of the lagoon. Guardia di Finanza reports during this period document that illegal intrusions at Poveglia not only continued but increased in frequency. Police archives reveal regular arrests of urban photographers, amateur ghost hunters and curious tourists who arrived at the island in private boats or kayaks, generally during nighttime hours to avoid detection. Some of these incidents, as judicial archives document, resulted in significant fines for offenders, but this did not seem to deter others from attempting to visit the forbidden island. Public photographic archives and satellite images available in Italian governmental databases show the progression of structural deterioration during these years. Comparisons of aerial photographs taken in 2014 with those from 2020 reveal complete collapse of several additional roofs, accelerated vegetation invasion, and general deterioration of structures. Technical documents from remote structural evaluations conducted using these aerial images confirmed that multiple buildings had reached deterioration states where they represented significant risks of total collapse. The bridge connecting the main island with the adjacent octagonal fortification had suffered damage so severe that inspectors considered it probably no longer safe to cross. During these years, Poveglia continued attracting international media attention, though now mixing its real documented history with increasingly sensationalist and supernatural elements. Digital newspaper archives reveal articles in international publications describing Poveglia as the most haunted island in the world, or Italy's most terrifying place. These articles generally contained elements of the island's true documented history, such as its use as a plague lazzaretto and later psychiatric institution, but frequently embellished these facts with unverifiable claims about paranormal phenomena, undocumented sadistic medical experiments, and urban legends that had no basis in official historical archives. One particularly persistent element in these media narratives, though completely absent from verifiable official documentation, was the story of a sadistic doctor who supposedly had worked at Poveglia's psychiatric institution, performing cruel experiments on patients, and who finally committed suicide jumping from San Vitale's bell tower after going mad himself. Historical researchers who have exhaustively studied Venetian medical and judicial archives have found no evidence whatsoever supporting this specific story. There are no newspaper records from the era reporting such a suicide, no judicial documents about medical malpractice investigations at Poveglia, and provincial medical personnel archives contain no references to any incident of this type. However, this legend had become so widely disseminated on the internet and international media that many people believed it factual. Academic archives reveal that during the 2010s and early 2020s, several historians and anthropologists began seriously studying Poveglia as a case study about how real historical sites with genuinely tragic pasts can become objects of paranormal fascination that obscure their true documented history. Academic articles published in Italian and European history journals examined how popular narrative about Poveglia had evolved from verifiable facts, such as its documented role during plague epidemics and its function as a psychiatric institution, toward an amalgam of reality and fiction where it became increasingly difficult for the general public to distinguish between verifiable historical elements and sensationalist embellishments. But the year 2025 would finally bring a significant development in Poveglia's long saga. Official documents published by the Agenzia del Demanio reveal that after years of negotiations and deliberations, the Italian government finally granted a 99-year concession over Poveglia. CNN archives and other international news agencies document that on August 1, 2025, the association Poveglia per Tutti, which had originally formed during the failed auction of 2014, took official possession of the island under the terms of this long-term concession. Concession documents, as journalistic archives report, specify that Poveglia Pertuti has received usage rights of the island for 99 years with the specific mandate to transform it into an urban park accessible exclusively to Venice residents. Concession terms, as official documents reveal, explicitly prohibit commercial tourist access. The island must remain as public space for Venetians, not become another tourist attraction in a city already overwhelmed by mass tourism. This restriction represents official recognition that Poveglia holds special meaning for Venice residents that transcends its potential as a tourist attraction. Journalistic archives document statements from Patricia Veclani, one of Poveglia Pertuti's founders, explaining the organization's vision for the island. According to these archive statements, the goal is not simply to create a recreational park, but to establish a space that honors Poveglia's complex and tragic history while providing Venetians a place for reflection and connection with their cultural heritage. Documents reveal that Poveglia Pertuti plans to work with the ASIM laboratory of the University of Verona's Human Sciences Department to scientifically guide the island's transformation, ensuring that any renovation respects both the site's historical importance and ethical considerations related to its past as a massive cemetery. The challenges facing Poveglia Pertuti are monumental, as technical reports and engineering analyses cited in journalistic archives document. The island completely lacks electricity and running water, services that must be installed from scratch. Existing buildings require exhaustive structural evaluations to determine which can be safely saved and renovated and which represent collapse risks so severe they must be demolished. The island's soil, which historical geological studies confirmed contains significant concentrations of human remains, presents unique ethical and practical challenges for any excavation or construction work. Any development must be carried out with extreme care to not disturb historic mass graves lying beneath much of the island's surface. Archives reveal that, beyond these technical challenges, there is the question of how to appropriately present Poveglia's history to future visitors. Poveglia Pertuti planning documents mention intentions to create some type of interpretive center or memorial that educates visitors about the island's true documented history. This would include information about the prosperous medieval Povegliati community, the devastating impact of the War of Chioggia, the island's role during plague epidemics when more than 100,000 people died there, and its subsequent use as a psychiatric institution. The challenge will be presenting this history in a way that is historically accurate, based on verifiable archival documentation, and respectful to the tens of thousands of people who suffered and died on the island. Testimonies from Venetian residents collected by journalists and archived in digital newspaper archives reveal mixed reactions to Poveglia Pertuti's concession. Some Venetians express satisfaction that the island will finally remain as public space rather than being commercially developed. Others express skepticism about whether the organization will truly have the financial and technical resources necessary to successfully transform an island abandoned for over 50 years into a functional park. Some older Venice residents, as archived interviews document, express continuing discomfort with the whole idea of Poveglia, citing superstitions transmitted for generations about the island's cursed nature. The most recent photographic archives of Poveglia, taken from authorized drones after Poveglia Pertuti took possession, show the island's current state in 2025. The bell tower of San Vitale remains standing, still the most prominent and recognizable structure. The 18 buildings comprising the remains of the former psychiatric and geriatric institution show various states of deterioration, some with partially intact roofs, others completely collapsed and barely recognizable as structures. Vegetation covers much of the island, with trees, bushes, and invasive plants that have grown uncontrolled for decades. Paths and roads that once connected different buildings are barely visible under vegetation. The octagonal fortification adjacent to the main island remains structurally intact but equally invaded by vegetation. A significant rabbit colony inhabits the island, as observations from forest rangers and biologists who have officially visited Poveglia document. These animals, probably descendants of pets abandoned or illegally released on the island during its decades of abandonment, have thrived in the absence of natural predators. The vineyards that were once cultivated in parts of the island during its inhabited periods have returned to wilderness but still produce grapes, though no one harvests them. This detail, documented in agricultural reports, adds an ironic note. Even after centuries of death and abandonment, life persists at Poveglia in unexpected forms. Official documents reveal that transforming Poveglia into a public park will be a process taking years, possibly decades. Preliminary timelines mentioned in planning documents suggest that even initial phases of structural evaluation, basic services installation, and safety restoration will take several years. Full opening to the Venetian public probably will not occur until well into the 2030s, according to estimates archived in planning documents. Meanwhile, Poveglia remains technically closed to the public even under the new concession, though now under Poveglia Pertuti's administration instead of the Demanio dello Stato. Archives reveal the organization has established cooperation with local authorities to continue patrolling waters around the island and prevent illegal intrusions, which continue being a problem according to recent Guardia di Finanza reports. The stated goal is to protect both potential intruders' safety, who run significant risks of injuries in structurally compromised buildings, and the historic site's integrity itself. Poveglia's history, as documented in publicly accessible historical archives, represents a microcosm of both admirable and terrible aspects of European human history. Documents reveal an island that was home to a prosperous community for centuries, that suffered destruction during wars, that became the first line of defense against devastating epidemics, that housed over 100,000 dead during the worst pandemics in European history, that functioned as an institution for elderly and mentally ill for decades, and that was finally abandoned and forgotten for over half a century. Archives document each of these phases with varying degrees of completeness, providing a verifiable historical narrative that proves sufficiently terrible without need for supernatural embellishments. The questions surrounding Poveglia in 2025 remain partially unanswered, as contemporary archives reveal. How many people exactly died on the island during its century as a Lazzaretto? Historical archives provide estimates ranging from 100,000 to 160,000, but fragmentary documentation means we will never know the exact number. Where exactly are all the mass graves located? Historical geological studies suggest they are scattered throughout much of the island, but precise maps were never created or do not survive in archives. What did patients of the psychiatric institution between 1922 and 1968 really experience? Medical archives are fragmentary and incomplete, leaving the individual experiences of hundreds of people largely undocumented and unknown. Poveglia remains in 2025 as a silent testament to dark chapters in human history, the devastation of plague epidemics, frequently inadequate and inhumane approaches toward mental health in the past, and long-term consequences of institutional neglect. Official documents confirm that the island is simultaneously a site of significant historical importance, a massive unmarked cemetery, and a symbol of how society has historically treated its most vulnerable members, the sick, the elderly, and those with mental illnesses. The bell tower of San Vitale, originally built in the 12th century when Poveglia was still a prosperous community, has silently observed everything that has occurred on the island for over 900 years. It has seen the evacuation of Povegliati during the War of Chioggia, barges loaded with plague victim corpses, black smoke from mass cremations, the arrival of psychiatric patients, the final evacuation in 1968, and decades of total abandonment. Technical documents confirm it remains structurally sound, a reminder that even the most durable structures we create eventually witness histories we could never imagine when we built them. Poveglia's documented history, preserved in historical archives accessible in Venice and throughout Italy, serves as a reminder that sometimes verifiable reality proves more fascinating and terrible than any fiction. We do not need to invent ghost stories or non-existent sadistic doctors to recognize that Poveglia is a place of profound historical importance and emotional weight. The documented facts, by themselves, tell a sufficiently powerful story. A small 7-hectare island that housed the suffering and death of over 100,000 human beings, that was abandoned and forgotten for decades, and that finally, in 2025, begins an uncertain new chapter in its long and tortuous history. Poveglia's future remains, at the time of writing, uncertain. Archives document intentions and plans, but the island's history has repeatedly demonstrated that plans for Poveglia frequently fail or transform in unexpected ways. What proves true, as all available documents confirm, is that Poveglia will always carry with it the weight of its past, literally in the soil containing the remains of tens of thousands of dead, and figuratively in the collective memory of Venice and the world. The cursed island of the Venetian lagoon, as it has come to be known, waits to see what its next chapter will bring in a history already spanning 1,600 years of documented human existence.